Colonel Diego Rivera would never forget that night. On August 15, 2010, around 3 in the morning, a message came through that sent his heart racing and his mind into overdrive. His instincts kicked in immediately. This wasn't just another robbery. It was something far greater, far more sinister. As he read the message to the end, the weight of it hit him. $500 million had vanished. In a single night. But it wasn't just the money. It was something deeper, something he couldn't yet grasp. His hands trembled as he grabbed his phone and started calling his team. The city appeared to be at rest, but Rivera knew this was just the beginning. What lay ahead was something that would reshape everything he once believed to be stable. They reached the Bank of Mexico just 15 minutes after receiving the alert. The city was eerily quiet, but as they approached the towering bank facade, a cold sense of foreboding gripped him. There were no signs of a typical robbery, no broken windows, no forced doors, and, most alarmingly, no alarm. Just an eerie silence, an emptiness that seemed to consume everything. How could such wealth vanish without a trace? As a police colonel, Rivera had dealt with countless tough cases, but what lay before him this time stretched his nerves to their breaking point. There were no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, nothing out of place except the missing money. Every account was checked, every transaction verified. But it was only when Rivera stumbled upon a small, seemingly insignificant detail in the bank records that he realized something was off, something that shouldn't have been there. Colonel Diego Rivera never forgot the moment he saw it. Amid hundreds of seemingly routine transactions, one stood out. At first glance, just another standard transfer of large sums between accounts without any obvious irregularities. But something about it felt off, like a clue that couldn't be ignored, though its significance wasn't clear right away. Suspicion crept in when Rivera recognized that one of the transactions involved a company with connections to businessmen from cases in his past. But it was the next discovery that truly piqued his interest, a transaction of $20 million. This wasn't a typical transfer. It was too large, too clean. There were no signs of it following the usual banking process. Everything appeared to be in order, yet something about it didn't sit right. What struck him even more was the company behind the payment. It had no visible ties to any major international financial institutions or corporations. It existed only on paper, with new accounts and no history. But among the details there was one unmistakable thing: the signature of the person who initiated the transaction. Not the name itself, but the style, the unmistakable mark of his former partner, Miguel. It was no longer a coincidence. Rivera understood in that instant. This was a link to something much larger than he could have ever anticipated. Colonel Diego Rivera had known Miguel for years. They had served together in the police force, and to Rivera, Miguel was the embodiment of integrity. Honest, reliable, disciplined. Miguel was the one who kept things together, the one who would never tolerate even the slightest hint of corruption. His reputation within the police was untarnished, and he was a brother, a friend, someone Rivera could always trust in the most trying moments. So when Rivera came across a suspicious transaction, his instincts immediately pointed to Miguel. At first, it seemed impossible, but something about the transaction triggered memories of Miguel's distinct signature style. Rivera knew that Miguel was meticulous with numbers and paperwork, and even small details like his signature always stood out. This one matched. It could have been a coincidence, but Rivera's gut told him otherwise. What troubled him more was Miguel's position. He had become influential at the bank, with connections that spanned the police and business worlds. With such power, Miguel could easily facilitate operations with minimal traces. That's when the truth began to sink in. This wasn't a random crime. It was part of something larger, and Miguel might just be at the center of it. Colonel Diego Rivera knew Miguel like a brother. They had worked together on countless investigations, and Rivera had always trusted him, even in the most complex cases. Miguel was methodical, always leaving behind minimal evidence, a master at operating behind the scenes. It was this skill that allowed him to execute a heist of such magnitude. It wasn't just a financial operation. It was a test of nerves, trust, and precision. Even Rivera, his longtime friend, had been kept in the dark. But everything changed when Rivera realized that Miguel had become a part of the system he had always fought to protect. It shattered his perception of the world. What had once been a straightforward fight for justice was now a labyrinth of corruption stretching from the police to the banks, from businessmen to politicians. The realization hit him hard. This case was no longer just about the law. It was personal. The deeper he dug, the more he understood that this investigation could cost him far more than his career. It could cost him his very soul. Doubts began to creep in. Had he been blind to the truth all these years? If Miguel was involved, how many others in his team, in the police, had turned against him? How many had been wearing the mask of a friend, all while betraying the very country they swore to protect? Colonel Diego Rivera found himself trapped in a web of uncertainty, unable to separate truth from deception. The more he tried to make sense of it all, the more tangled the facts became. The hardest part was confronting the realization that his friend, Miguel, someone he had known his entire life, had become the very enemy he had sworn to fight. In a world now filled with hidden dangers, Rivera found himself questioning who he could trust. Standing before the bank, a once powerful symbol now reduced to an empty facade, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything he believed in had been a lie. The crime scene before him was just the surface of a much deeper corruption. As a colonel, he had respected the system, but now it seemed like the system had turned against him, leaving him in despair. Time was slipping away, and without concrete evidence, Rivera felt powerless. He had no idea what the full extent of the conspiracy would reveal. But one thing was clear. The night's events were just the beginning. If he had known the true scale of the crime, he might never have started. But by then, it was too late. His world was already unraveling. Colonel Diego Rivera felt a growing sense of dread as Miguel disappeared without a trace. No longer at the bank, unreachable and silent, Miguel's absence only deepened the mystery. Rivera knew that, if Miguel had been involved, he should have noticed sooner, but he hadn't. He had been blind to the cartel's deep-rooted influence in the country's financial systems. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Rivera came to a terrifying realization. His entire team might be entangled in this vast, far-reaching network. Even worse, he might be a part of it too, caught in a system that stretched through every major institution. What had initially seemed like a robbery now revealed itself as the start of something much darker, a war where people like him had no place. Rivera's understanding grew clearer. If he didn't act now, everything he had fought for, everything he had dedicated his life to, could be lost forever. It was August 5th, 2010, at 10:30 p.m. The city was wrapped in the stillness of the night, the streets barren except for the occasional car rushing by, its headlights cutting fiery trails through the darkness. I was at my desk in the police station, surrounded by the familiar hum of late-night work, when my phone buzzed. Miguel's name flashed on the screen. At first, it seemed like a routine call from an old friend, but something in the back of my mind told me otherwise. There was a weight in the air, a sense that this wasn't just a friendly conversation. As I picked up, his voice confirmed it, tense, hurried, and laced with fear. "Antonio, you need to know something important," he said. His words hit me like a warning shot, though at the time I couldn't fully grasp what they meant. I only knew one thing. Whatever Miguel was about to tell me, it would change everything. Fast forward to August 15th, 2010, 11:15 p.m. Miguel and I met at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. The dim lighting reflected his unease, and his hands trembled as he reached for his coffee. He looked like a man torn apart by what he knew. His usually composed demeanor had been replaced by confusion and guilt. I didn't hold back. "Why didn't you warn me sooner?" I asked. My frustration spilled out. Why stay silent while the Los Lobos cartel was planning a heist of this scale? His face darkened as he struggled to find the words. Finally, he began to speak. "This isn't just a robbery," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You still don't understand what's really behind this. They didn't just steal money, Antonio. This is about destabilizing the country, tearing it apart from the inside." I stared at him, trying to process the weight of his words. He leaned in closer, his expression grim. "And you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're already part of this game." In that moment, everything clicked into place. The heist, the missing money, the network of corruption I was beginning to uncover. Miguel wasn't just giving me a warning. He was handing me a glimpse into a conspiracy that stretched far beyond anything I could have imagined. I didn't know what scared me more, the scale of the plan he hinted at or the realization that I was already entangled in its threads. This wasn't just another case. It was a battle for the soul of the country, and for my own. Los Lobos were no ordinary cartel. Unlike the many that rose and fell with their leaders, Los Lobos had a presence that transcended borders. Their reach extended from Mexico to the United States, and even into Europe. They weren't just drug traffickers, they had embedded themselves into the fabric of the system. Their influence spread through the police, financial institutions, and key government sectors. They understood how the system worked and, more importantly, how to bend it to their will. I had heard of Los Lobos before. Their leader, Pablo Los Lobos Gonzalez, was notorious for his ruthlessness and strategic mind. He didn't rely solely on violence, he used fear, yes, but more than that, he had a network capable of erasing any trace of their activities. They knew how to navigate the shadows, using their connections within the police and local authorities to cover their tracks. A robbery, like the one we were investigating, wasn't out of the ordinary for them. It was just one piece of a much larger, far more intricate plan. But what Miguel revealed shattered everything I thought I knew. Isabel, a trusted member of Pablo's inner circle, had confided in Miguel about something crucial. Her older brother worked in the police, and he was one of the masterminds behind this conspiracy. That revelation changed everything. Los Lobos weren't just planning a heist, they were orchestrating a much deeper plot. Their true aim wasn't just to steal money from a bank, it was to destabilize the country's financial and political systems. They sought to create chaos, disrupt the economy, and manipulate political decisions, all while remaining in the shadows, pulling the strings of power. "This isn't just theft," Miguel said, his voice heavy with urgency. "It's war, a war you didn't expect." On August 16, 2010, at 4 p.m., new documents arrived. As I sifted through them, my worst suspicions were confirmed. One of the executives at the bank where the robbery had taken place was directly linked to Los Lobos. He wasn't just involved, he was a central player in their scheme. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't a simple theft. The robbery was just the beginning. There were complex manipulations within the bank's systems, a well-coordinated plan that unfolded through both their computer networks and the inside staff. The reach of this criminal network knew no boundaries. Pablo Los Lobos Gonzalez and his cartel weren't just after money. They were executing a much larger plan to destabilize the entire financial system. Their goal was to create a power structure so dominant that no political force could stand against them. The robbery, the manipulation, it was all part of an elaborate strategy to take control from within. Pablo wasn't just the leader of a cartel. He was a symbol of a new kind of power, where money, politics, and influence were fused into an unstoppable force. With their connections, Los Lobos could tear the state systems apart and use them for their own gain. And they didn't need violence to do it. They wielded influence over key decisions, ensuring their plans unfolded with minimal resistance. It became clear that Pablo Los Lobos was behind a massive conspiracy, but his intentions went far beyond wealth. This wasn't just about money. It was a battle for hegemony, for control over every aspect of the country's life. To achieve this, he was willing to eliminate any obstacle, dismantle any system standing in his way. Miguel's confession shook me to the core. "I had no choice, Antonio," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "My family was under their control. If I hadn't joined in, I couldn't protect them." His words were a dagger to my heart. The web of influence was so vast, so insidious, that even the closest people to us were caught in its grip. On August 17, 2010, at 6:30 p.m., I left the investigation, completely drained and disturbed by the new revelations. It was clear now that we were not just dealing with a simple bank robbery. This was the beginning of something much darker and much more dangerous. I wasn't just up against a cartel. I was facing an entire network of forces that supported them. If we didn't act now, we were on the verge of a new era of criminal power that would change everything. On the night of August 5th, 2010, at 10:30 p.m., Colonel Diego Rivera sat alone in his office. The city was silent, the streets empty except for the occasional passing car. Rivera received a call from Miguel, and immediately he knew something was wrong. "Antonio, you need to know something important." Miguel's voice crackled urgently. There was an unease in his tone that set Rivera on edge, as if the truth they were about to uncover would be far darker than he had imagined. The next night at 11:15 p.m., Miguel arrived at a cafe, his face pale. Rivera, sensing the gravity of the situation, asked why he hadn't warned him sooner. Miguel's voice was barely above a whisper as he revealed, "This isn't just a robbery, Antonio. They're trying to destabilize the country, and you're already part of this game." Los Lobos was no ordinary cartel. Their reach extended far beyond Mexico, into the U.S. and even Europe. With influence over the police, banks, and financial institutions, they had mastered the art of manipulation, controlling systems from within. I had heard of them before. Their leader, Pablo Los Lobos Gonzalez, was notorious for his ruthlessness and his uncanny ability to control people. Not just through violence, but through fear and strategy. They had connections everywhere, and for them, a heist like the one we were investigating was just another piece in a far grander plan. Miguel's words shattered everything I thought I knew about the cartel, and my own role in it. Isabel, a trusted subordinate of Pablo, revealed something crucial to Miguel. Her older brother worked in the police and was one of the key players in this vast conspiracy. This changed everything. It meant that Los Lobos were not simply planning to steal money from a bank. Their real aim was to destabilize the entire country, starting with its financial and political systems. They sought to create chaos, erode economic stability, and undermine political authority, all to control the country from behind the scenes, manipulating the most important decisions. "This isn't just theft," Miguel said, his voice heavy with the weight of the revelation. "It's war. A war you didn't expect." August 16th, 2010, 4 p.m. The new documents I received confirmed the growing fears. One of the executives at the bank where the robbery had occurred was directly connected to Los Lobos. He was a central figure in the cartel's plan. The scheme was far more sophisticated than a simple robbery. It involved manipulating banking systems and executing complex operations through computer systems and insider collaboration within the bank. It became clear that this criminal network had no boundaries. The August 2010 bank robbery was just the beginning. We now understood that the real objective was not to steal cash. It was to shake the very foundation of the financial system. Pablo Los Lobos and his cartel sought to gain such overwhelming influence that no political force could stand against them. Their ambitions extended well beyond a typical heist. Pablo wasn't just a cartel leader. He was the embodiment of a new era of power, where money, politics, and influence fused into an unstoppable force. His cartel had the connections and the strategic leverage to dismantle the state system whenever they wished, using it to their advantage. And they didn't need to rely on brute force. They wielded the power to shape decisions and control the key players in society. It soon became clear that Pablo Los Lobos was the mastermind behind this vast conspiracy. His objective was not just personal wealth, it was a power grab, a battle for control over every aspect of the country's life. And to achieve his goal, he was willing to obliterate any system or obstacle in his path. Miguel, with a heavy heart, confessed that even his family had been drawn into this web. "I had no choice, Antonio. My family was under their control. If I hadn't joined this game, I couldn't protect them," he said, his voice quiet, burdened. His words hit me hard. The system had become so deeply ingrained that even the closest relationships were no safeguard. August 17th, 2010, 6:30 p.m. I walked away from the investigation, overwhelmed by the new revelations. I now understood that we weren't dealing with just a robbery. We were facing something far larger. This was just the beginning. It wasn't just the cartel we had to contend with. It was the entire network supporting them. If we didn't stop this now, we were on the brink of a new era, one dominated by criminal influence. Colonel Diego Rivera sat in his office, staring at the data before him. It was late, the kind of stillness only the night could bring. Outside, the moon cast a cold light over the city, its beams cutting through the shadows. The city felt distant, as if the country itself was sinking into the darkness around him. He knew this was no ordinary crime. This was an attack, its scale still beyond his comprehension. The bank heist, Rivera realized, was just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. Los Lobos hadn't just stolen $500 million. They had grander ambitions. This was the start of a political revolution, years in the making. The cartel was not just a drug organization. They were architects of power, manipulating the political system in ways more sinister than he had anticipated. Rivera felt a cold chill as the full scope of their plans began to sink in. This wasn't about money, it was about control, and the stability of the nation was at stake. Colonel Diego Rivera sat alone in his office, a quiet weight pressing on his chest. The people he had once trusted, those at the top, the ones he had relied on, now seemed to him nothing more than mere pieces on a chessboard. The fight had shifted. They were no longer up against simple criminals. This was no longer a typical investigation. It had grown into a battle for control over the very heart of the nation. And Rivera knew that in this fight there could be no room for weakness. Every step forward felt like a step deeper into a trap, each move calculated to ensnare him. One thought consumed him, a thought that refused to let go. Miguel. All those years, those casual meetings, those words that seemed insignificant at the time, now they had transformed into something entirely different. The pieces began to fall into place. Rivera now understood that Miguel had not been just another employee at the bank. He was a part of the very conspiracy Rivera had been fighting against. All this time, Miguel had been a key player in the game. As the realization hit him, Rivera knew the stakes had changed. It wasn't just about finding the guilty anymore. It was about identifying the true enemy, and that enemy was much closer than he had ever imagined. On the night of August 20th, 2010, Miguel entered Rivera's office, his presence no longer reassuring. His face had changed, just like everything else around them. The same features that once exuded trust now seemed to harbor a strange ambiguity. His eyes, once familiar, no longer offered the certainty Rivera had relied on. He wasn't the friend Rivera had known. At that moment, the full weight of what was happening settled on him. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that nothing in his world would ever be the same again. Colonel Diego Rivera sat in his office, the weight of Miguel's words hanging in the air. He watched as Miguel, avoiding his gaze, spoke with a tremor in his voice, one that was unmistakably different from the confident tone Rivera had once known. "Antonio, we need to act fast," Miguel said, his eyes not meeting Rivera's. The words were urgent, but there was a subtle uncertainty that had not been there before. "I became part of this plan because I had no choice. They have my family, and they know what to do with people who don't obey." The truth hit Rivera harder than he had anticipated. He had never imagined Miguel, his trusted ally, could be caught in this web of manipulation. Yet here they were. But Miguel did not immediately elaborate. His eyes clouded with emotion, a far-off look crossing his face as he began to recount how the cartel had ensnared his family. It had happened swiftly. Miguel had been blindsided. The cartel had been watching him for months, a reality he had failed to grasp. They had known his every move and, more chillingly, they had known where his family lived. It was all so precise, so calculated, but subtle enough to avoid detection. They didn't make any overt threats. They didn't need to. For them, this was just another part of their larger plan. "They came to me at night. Just 5 of them." Miguel's voice cracked as he spoke. Rivera could hear the pain in his words. "I was at home with my wife, my kids. They broke down the door, took us all down to the basement. I thought it was the end. that I would never see them alive again. They said if I didn't follow their orders, my kids would be gone. The words echoed in Rivera's mind, leaving him momentarily speechless. He hadn't expected this. They had never spoken of such horrors. But now, as he sat in the oppressive silence of his office, the full weight of Miguel's confession sank in. Like Rivera, Miguel had become a victim of this monstrous scheme. He had been forced into this dark game, with no room to escape, just as Rivera had been. And just as Rivera had, Miguel had made his choice. He was no longer the man Rivera had known. He was no longer his friend. He had become a cog in the machine that Rivera was desperately trying to dismantle. Miguel's fate had been sealed long before this conversation began. Rivera now understood. There was no place for friendship here, only the ruthless reality of survival within a corrupted system. Colonel Diego Rivera sat in his office digesting the gravity of Miguel's words. The truth about the cartel's plan was unfolding before him, and it was worse than anything he had imagined. Miguel spoke with a heavy heart, detailing how the money stolen from the bank wasn't simply filling the pockets of the cartel. No, it was being used for something far more insidious. "They're buying votes, Antonio," Miguel explained, his voice tinged with fear. "They've infiltrated the entire political system. They can replace the country's political elite. Their plan is to destroy the government from the inside out and replace it with their own leadership. They want to be the new rulers of this country." Colonel Rivera's mind reeled. This was not just a robbery, not just a criminal cartel on the rise. It was an all-out assault on the very foundation of the nation he had sworn to protect. The country's political system, the very institutions he had relied on, had been corrupted. What was even more terrifying was how deep the cartel's reach had become. They were no longer just drug traffickers. They had evolved into a political force capable of changing the future of the nation. No one, it seemed, could stand in their way. The betrayal hit harder than any enemy Rivera had ever faced. The system, the institutions, the very power structure he had trusted for years, had become part of the problem. His mission had just expanded. His enemies were no longer limited to the cartel itself, but to the very system they had managed to infiltrate and corrupt. In the thick of that same night, Rivera, driven by a sense of urgency, followed Miguel toward the bank. It was there, amid the shadows, that the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Miguel led him through the familiar corridors of the bank, but now everything seemed different. Every trace, every detail that they had been chasing, pointed back to Miguel. The evidence which once seemed like isolated incidents was now part of a larger, carefully constructed trap. Rivera felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He realized that he was no longer just a soldier fighting criminals. He was now facing a war on two fronts, one against the cartel and the other against the system itself. The full scope of the operation had only just begun to reveal itself, and Rivera could already sense the danger of the path they were on. The stakes were higher than ever, and the game they were playing had become far more complex. Colonel Diego Rivera sat in the dim light of his office, the weight of Miguel's words sinking in. The bank heist had not been a random act of greed. It had been a calculated move in a much larger game. Miguel explained the intricate details. Bank employees had been bribed, and key members of the cartel had ensured access to crucial financial channels. This was a strategic step in a global operation, and the cartel wouldn't stop until they had achieved their ultimate goal. They had infiltrated not just the banking system, but the very core of the nation's economy, politics, and elections. As Rivera absorbed the full extent of the situation, the realization hit him harder than ever. There was no easy way out. The cartel's reach had grown far beyond anything he had anticipated. They were manipulating every system, and now it was up to him to find a way to stop them. But the path ahead seemed uncertain, and the doubts crept in. He wasn't sure he could take them down alone, not with the cartel's vast influence and power. Miguel, who he now understood was no longer just an innocent bystander but an active participant in this dangerous game, looked at him with a renewed seriousness. Gone was the man Rivera once trusted. In his place was someone who had been sucked into the web of the cartel. But this time, there was no hesitation in Miguel's eyes. His expression showed a resigned understanding that there was no turning back. "Antonio, we have options," Miguel said, his voice steady despite the tension. "But they're risky. If we want to stop them, we need to move fast and act strategically." For the first time in weeks, Rivera felt a spark of hope, though it was tinged with uncertainty. Miguel's confidence stood in stark contrast to his own growing doubts. Still, Rivera knew that he couldn't afford to waste any more time. "We need to turn their system against them," Miguel continued. "We can use their methods, manipulate their own game. We need to find the weak points in their political structure, analyze their election campaigns, and place our people in key positions. The cartel may think they're invincible, but they can't control everything forever. If we do this right, we can break their power from the inside." The plan was risky, and the path to success seemed fraught with peril. But Rivera had no choice. If he didn't act now, the cartel would continue to tighten its grip on the country, and there would be no future to fight for. In that moment, the full weight of his responsibility settled over him. It was no longer just about stopping a heist. It was about saving his country from a force that had already infiltrated the highest levels of power. Colonel Diego Rivera sat back, weighing Miguel's proposal. It was a bold, desperate plan, one that spoke not of simple defiance but of a deeply strategic move to turn the tables. The complexity of the situation was overwhelming, but Rivera could no longer afford to hesitate. Miguel's idea was one that might seem hopeless to some. Infiltrate the cartel's own structure by using their own tactics against them. It was a dangerous game, one that had no place for the faint of heart. "We need to find where the cartel is most vulnerable," Miguel said, his voice steady despite the gravity of their conversation. "They control people and money, but there's one thing they can't fully control: information." Miguel's plan involved manipulating the system they had built. By creating fake political campaigns, aided by bribed journalists and politicians, they could stir division within the cartel's ranks. The goal was simple: create enough chaos to make them distrust each other. "Once they start questioning their own, we can make them implode," Miguel explained. "They won't even see it coming." The first step was to fabricate political campaigns that would appear to support the cartel's puppet politicians. This would sow suspicion, create friction, and force the cartel's political pawns to fight amongst themselves. It was a calculated gamble, but it could work. If successful, it would provide an opening, an opportunity to penetrate their control. Then came the most dangerous part of the plan. Miguel proposed that Rivera become the figurehead, a new leader, to rally people against the cartel's influence. By presenting Rivera as a symbol of hope and order, the plan aimed to draw in not just the general population, but also key political figures who had stayed on the sidelines. As Rivera would rise in prominence, a new network of influence would form around him, one that could challenge the cartel's stranglehold on power. "You'll be the face of this game, Antonio," Miguel said, his gaze intense, "but you have to be ready for anything. This isn't just a fight for the country, it's a fight for everything we ever knew." The weight of the words hung in the air. Rivera knew the stakes had never been higher. If they failed, the country would fall deeper into chaos. But if they succeeded, it could mean the end of the cartel's reign and the beginning of a new chapter in the nation's history. Rivera's decision would determine the outcome of this dangerous game. Colonel Diego Rivera faced a critical decision: follow Miguel's risky plan to deceive the system, or choose another path, one that could lead to even worse consequences. The deeper Rivera went, the clearer it became just how deeply the cartel had infiltrated every aspect of the nation. They were already in control, and they were playing a game where everyone else was a pawn, even if they didn't fully understand who was holding the strings. Miguel believed there was an opening. He saw that the cartel, despite its power, couldn't control everything at once. While their plan seemed well-structured, Rivera realized they were caught in a trap set by the cartel itself. Survival was no longer just about winning, it was about enduring. As the strategy unfolded, it seemed like they were making progress. Through manipulating election campaigns, bribing politicians, and influencing journalists, they managed to sow doubt within the cartel's ranks. It appeared as though they were shaking the cartel's foundation. But, with each move, Rivera sensed they were edging closer to a point of no return. Miguel remained confident, assuring Rivera that everything was going according to plan. Yet, Rivera could feel the pressure mounting. The cartel wasn't just deceiving them, it was also sabotaging their efforts from the shadows, stealing their chances at success before they could even take hold. The deeper they got, the clearer it became. The cartel wasn't just playing the game, they were rewriting the rules. One night, just as Colonel Diego Rivera began to believe victory might be within reach, Miguel arrived with unsettling news. His usual composure was gone, replaced by a seriousness Rivera had never seen before. "Antonio, they've already moved most of the money," Miguel said, his voice tense, and Rivera could feel the weight of his words. "They've used our own methods against us. All those political manipulations were just a cover to launder the funds through international financial channels. They're moving the money through banks in Europe and the US. This isn't just about stolen cash anymore. This is a global operation." Rivera stood frozen, processing the information. He understood, but it felt almost impossible to believe. All their efforts, every political maneuver, every fake strategy, had only been steps behind a much larger and more intricate scheme. The cartel had embedded itself so deeply into the global financial system that even the authorities couldn't touch them. "How are they doing this?" Rivera asked, still struggling to accept the overwhelming reality of the situation. Miguel paused before responding, his voice heavy with a truth that was becoming impossible to ignore. "It's hard to grasp, but they've been collaborating with powerful international players for years. Those who should be enforcing the law are too afraid of the cartel's connections to politicians and financiers. They turn a blind eye. This isn't just a drug cartel anymore, it's a global business empire." Colonel Diego Rivera struggled to comprehend the sheer scale of the cartel's reach. It wasn't confined to Latin America anymore. It extended across Europe, Asia, and even the US. Using their vast financial network, they funneled billions through covert banking systems, hiding their money across countless companies and accounts. The international bankiers had known all along who the real players were, but no one dared challenge them. The cartel had woven itself into the fabric of the global financial system, becoming an invisible yet formidable force, controlling vast amounts of money and influence. No matter how hard Rivera tried to push through the growing sense of helplessness, it was clear the barriers were insurmountable. Even the highest political institutions, those he once tried to recruit, had now become part of the cartel's game. His efforts had been in vain. The system was so corrupt that even if they managed to strike a blow against the cartel in one area, it was already 5 steps ahead, preparing to retreat and regroup. But the most crushing realization was that no one seemed willing to take action. Those who could have helped, from key political figures to influential business leaders, were paralyzed by fear of the cartel's vast influence. They refused to confront the truth of the situation. Miguel and Rivera were alone in their fight, their final attempts to expose the corruption on the brink of failure. In that moment, Rivera understood the true scope of the cartel's power. It was no longer just a criminal organization. It had become an unstoppable force, its influence so deeply embedded in the system that all they could do was watch it triumph. Despite the defeat, Rivera couldn't help but feel that perhaps this wasn't their last chance. Maybe in time, they could find another way. But it didn't matter. They were powerless before the global machine the cartel had created. The final betrayal, a twist of despair that shattered everything. From the moment Colonel Diego Rivera uncovered the vast reach of the cartel's influence, it became evident that the world he once knew, where truth and justice had meaning, no longer existed. Every move he made felt like a step further into a game already devised by the cartel. Their power was overwhelming, their money woven into every corner of the system, and no one seemed capable of halting their advance. As days passed, Rivera's sense of despair deepened. Miguel, once his ally, had become another figure he could no longer trust. Consumed by the cartel's world, Miguel refused to step away from it. even at the cost of betraying Rivera. His words echoed the growing hopelessness. "This is a big game, Antonio. There are no winners or losers here. There are only those who know how to survive." In the face of this harsh reality, Rivera's mission had transformed. His ideals of justice and righteousness crumbled. He had become just another pawn in a game he could no longer control. When he realized he could not change the system from within, he made the painful decision to leave the force. His battle against the system was no longer his to fight. During the time when Colonel Diego Rivera began to lose faith in the institutions that once seemed to offer protection, a final realization dawned on him. The only remaining option was to understand how the cartel manipulated the financial system. If he could prove it, if he could gather the evidence, he believed even the cartel would not escape punishment. He knew he might not change the situation immediately, but at the very least, he could hand over the final documents to those in power, who might make a difference. There was no time to waste, each day counted. Miguel tried to dissuade him, but Rivera's determination was unwavering. He meticulously compiled all the necessary information, tracing how the cartel funneled money through international banks, offshore zones, and shell companies. Every step of the scheme was carefully documented. His goal was now clear: gather the final proof to expose how this network operated. Taking a leave of absence, Rivera traveled to London, where he pieced together the last elements of the puzzle. His former colleagues in the police, whom he turned to for help, refused to assist him. They were either too afraid or aligned with the cartel, but Rivera knew he couldn't leave the case unresolved. This was his last chance. In London, Colonel Diego Rivera found a lawyer with access to offshore accounts, and through him he obtained crucial documents. These included lists of fake companies through which billions of dollars flowed, names of politicians receiving bribes, and most importantly, recordings implicating international financial institutions in the scheme. With the evidence in hand, Rivera was ready to deliver the documents to those with the power to stop the cartel. Miguel had warned him that this could be his final move, but Rivera didn't hesitate. Upon returning, he set his plan in motion. His objective was clear. He had to pass on the information to those who could make a difference, those who had the influence to push the investigation forward and potentially halt the cartel's corruption. He found allies among the few who still believed in justice and truth. The final stage, however, proved even more perilous. One night, as Rivera met with an influential official, he received a chilling message. "They know. You won't make it in time to hand over the documents." That was the final twist. Colonel Diego Rivera made his way to the meeting, but a sinking feeling told him he was being followed. The cartel wouldn't let anyone stand in their way. As he walked through the empty streets, the dark shadows of pursuers mirrored his every step. They were close. He passed on the documents, proof of everything, and knew in that moment that his actions no longer mattered. He left the country, but not to start a new life. He simply disappeared, without a trace. No panic, no farewell. He severed all ties, walked away from his job, his career in the police, and even his own name. The efforts he had poured into trying to stop the cartel now seemed insignificant. Perhaps he had never truly changed anything. Perhaps he had only been another pawn in their game. Now all he could do was watch as the cartel continued its relentless advance. They had won. They already held control. And the most unsettling part was that despite handing over the final evidence to those who could make a difference, the cartel remained unstoppable. In the final scene, Rivera watched them prepare for their next move. They moved forward, unwavering. And as he looked on, the truth became clear. This was not his victory. It was theirs. They controlled everything now. All that remained was to wait for their next move to unfold. For Rivera, the fight was over. But for the cartel, this was only another step toward their inevitable reign.